They left me without a word. The dinner rush ended at 8:47 and my manager told me I was cut for the evening, which meant $63 I hadn't planned to lose. He said it to the wall behind my head, which was how he said most things to me. As if I were an inconvenience the room was housing temporarily. I didn't argue. I took off my apron in the back hallway, folded it twice over the hook, and went out the rear exit into the alley because the front of Sorrento's still held the last table's noise, and I needed to be somewhere the noise wasn't. The alley behind the restaurant smelled like fryer oil and wet brick, and underneath everything, the ghost of the bread they delivered each morning at 5. November had arrived properly, which in Chicago meant the cold had opinions. I stood with my back against the wall, looked up at the narrow wedge of sky between the buildings, and let myself cry. Not dramatically. I want to be accurate about this. There was no heaving, no collapse. It was the kind of crying that happens when you've held pressure long enough, that it finds its own exit. Slow, involuntary, almost quiet. The eviction notice had arrived that morning. Second warning, formal language, a date circled by whoever circled those things. My father's creditors had called twice. I'd let them go to voicemail and deleted the messages without listening, which was a strategy with a limited future. And now $63 gone on a Tuesday, which was $63 I'd already assigned to an installment on a debt I hadn't even incurred. So I stood in the alley and let my face go wet and told myself it was just pressure releasing, physiological, manageable. I didn't hear the car stop. What I noticed was the headlight edge catching the brick beside me, and then the particular quality of the silence that followed. Not empty silence, but attentive silence. The kind with a shape. When I turned, a black car sat at the mouth of the alley, engine idling. Not parked. Stopped. The distinction matters. Parked is a decision made earlier. Stopped is a decision made now, in response to something. The window was already down. The man inside was in shadow, but I could see enough. The line of jaw, the stillness. People who are still in the way he was still don't become that way by accident. That kind of stillness is the result of having decided, long ago, that you don't waste movement. I wiped my face with the back of my wrist. "I'm fine," I said. Not to him, exactly. The words just needed somewhere to go, and the direction of the open window was the only direction available. He didn't say anything. I stood there. The cold had gotten into my coat, which wasn't buttoned because I'd forgotten in the hallway. I should have been afraid. A man in a car stopped in an alley watching a woman cry at night in a neighborhood where stopped cars and alleys occasionally meant nothing and occasionally meant everything. I knew the geometry of it. I'd grown up 4 blocks from here. I understood what this neighborhood contained. But his watching didn't feel like threat. It felt like attention, the specific, complete, unperformed kind. "You don't have to stay," I said. "I know," he said. His voice was low, not soft. There's a distinction. Soft is diminished. Low is foundational, the kind that doesn't require volume because volume would be redundant. I looked at him. He looked at me. "Are you safe?" he asked. The question landed strangely. Safe. I turned the word over. The eviction notice. The creditors. The job that trimmed me when the budget got tight. The debt that wasn't mine by origin, but was mine by inheritance in every way that mattered. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. I got the impression he didn't fully believe me, and also that he wasn't going to say so. "All right," he said. The window went up. The car didn't move immediately. There was a pause, a beat of something I couldn't name, and then it pulled away slowly. I watched the taillights until the alley went dark again. Then I stood in the dark a while longer, because something had happened and I couldn't identify what it was. He had seen me at my most private, not naked. That's not the word. More specific, he'd seen me at the moment I was being real, and I had not performed anything for him. I hadn't been brave or composed or functional. I'd just been there, wet-faced and cold, telling the air that I was fine. And he had listened, and left. I buttoned my coat, retrieved my bag from where it had slipped off my shoulder, walked the 12 minutes home to the apartment where the eviction notice sat on the kitchen table, with a coffee ring on one corner. because I'd set my mug on it that morning without thinking. I didn't know his name. I would by the following morning. I told myself, lying in the dark later, that none of it meant anything. That cars stopped in alleys sometimes for reasons that had nothing to do with women crying against brick walls. That the quality of his attention had been my projection. That I was tired and $63 short and reading the universe for signs because that's what people do when their lives feel ungovernable. I almost convinced myself. He sent Enzo for me at 7 the next morning. Enzo arrived at my door before I'd finished my coffee, which meant he'd either known my schedule or had been watching long enough to gauge it by the lights. He was 50-something, with the kind of face that suggested a long career of not being surprised. He wore a dark coat that fit well. He held his hat in his hands. He told me his name before I could ask, which I catalogued as the first deliberate courtesy of the morning. "Mr. Valentino would like to speak with you," he said. "I don't know a Mr. Valentino." "He knows you," Enzo said. "Has for a while." He said it without apology, which I suppose was also a courtesy. At least it was honest. I stood in my doorway holding my coffee mug and looked at this man who had arrived before 7 and was now looking back at me with the patient expression of someone who has made many unusual requests in his life and learned to wait for the yes. "Am I in danger if I come?" I asked. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not amusement, more like respect. "Not from us," he said. I put on my coat. I left the coffee. The car was different from last night's, same dark color, different model, and Enzo drove this one himself, the way he stood, without wasted motion. I sat in the back and watched my neighborhood pass outside the window and tried to construct a version of the morning that made sense. "Last night," I said. "Was that him? In the alley?" "Yes," Enzo said. "Was he following me?" A pause. "Careful. He knew where you'd be." I looked at the back of his head and decided not to ask the next question yet, because I didn't think I was ready for the answer, and I needed to be ready before I walked into a room with a man who'd known where I'd be before I did. The house was on a quiet street, in a part of the city that held its money without announcing it. The architecture was plain, restrained. A building that had decided the most expensive thing it could do was look unremarkable. Enzo brought me through the front door. The entrance hall smelled like floor wax and something faintly floral, and it was very quiet in a way that suggested the quiet was maintained rather than natural. Marco Valentino was in the room off the hall. In the alley, he'd been shadow and voice and a quality of stillness. In daylight, in a room, he was simply a man, which somehow made him harder to dismiss. Tall, dark-suited, standing near the window with his hands in his coat pockets in the way of someone who has never needed to announce himself with posture. His face was younger than what lived behind his eyes. He looked at me. I looked back. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." The silence that followed was not hostile. Something in him shifted, nearly invisibly, and then settled again. "All right," he said. He told me about my father's debts without prelude. Not all of it, I'd learn the full shape of it later. But enough. My father had borrowed from people whose money carried conditions, and those conditions had been purchased 6 months ago by a man named Salvatore Greco. When he said the name, Enzo, standing in the doorway, went very still. I noted that. Greco had bought the debt not for the money, but for the leverage. What he intended to do with it involved me and had nothing to do with anything I'd done. It was about my father's history, which was longer and more complicated than my father had ever indicated while alive. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you need to know." "Why does it matter to you?" He looked at me for a moment with an expression that gave me nothing. "You're in it now," he said, "whether I tell you or not." I stood in the middle of the room and processed this. The eviction notice, the creditors, all of it suddenly recontextualized against something much larger and much older than a landlord's patience, with a waitress falling behind. He offered what he called protection. A room in this house, not a prison. He said it without defensive emphasis, which suggested it was meant sincerely. He had other reasons for wanting me nearby that he didn't explain. I didn't ask. I was still absorbing the perimeter of the problem. If I refuse, I said. You go home, he said, and you handle it yourself. He said it without cruelty. He said it like a man who respected the option even if he didn't recommend it. I looked at him. Something in me was making a decision the rest of me hadn't finished processing. I was aware that the room had a gravity to it that was partly his presence and partly the information he'd given me, and partly the fact that I had been handling everything alone for 14 months, and I was very, very tired. I'll need my things, I said. I want to get them myself. He nodded. No argument. Rosa intercepted me at the bottom of the stairs on my way back through. Small, solid, gray-streaked hair, with the expression of someone who takes quick measures of situations and trusts them. First floor room, she said. There's a lock on the door. She paused. Use it, she said, at least until you know who's worth leaving it open for. I said I would. She looked at me for a moment longer than the instruction required, then said quietly without softening it. Girls come here sometimes. Not always for good reasons. You seem like a different kind of reason. I didn't know what to do with that. I took it with me when I went to get my things. The shape of Marco Valentino's world revealed itself in pieces. Not because he explained it. He didn't explain things as a matter of principle, but I'd spent 3 years as a waitress, which meant I'd developed the particular skill of reading rooms through what people didn't say to each other. I watched. Within 2 days, I had assembled an approximate map. The Valentino family controlled the northwest corridor of the city's organized network, territory that meant specific things in specific neighborhoods, the details of which I processed and set aside because I was already carrying enough. There were men who came and went, some who looked at me carefully, some who looked at me not at all, which was more informative. Enzo managed most of what came through the house. Marco managed what Enzo couldn't. He was not often present. When he was, the atmosphere changed in a way that was hard to articulate. Not tense, more concentrated, as if the house had been running at 90% capacity and his arrival brought it to full. I found myself noticing where he was. This was a problem I chose not to examine directly. On the third morning, Rosa told me my father had known Marco's family. Not Marco himself. His father, Vittorio, who had died 6 years ago. My father and Vittorio had done business together briefly in the 90s. Legitimate business as far as Rosa knew, though Rosa acknowledged her knowledge had limits. When my father had needed money later, after the business failed, after my mother left, after a sequence of bad years I'd experienced only as his general sadness, he'd gone to people with Valentino connections. Those people had eventually sold the debt to Greco. Marco didn't know until recently, Rosa said. About your father. About the debt. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and she was making something that smelled like the inside of my childhood. I looked at the wood grain. How recently? I said. About 2 weeks ago. I thought about the car in the alley, the window already down. So he knew who I was, I said, when he stopped. Yes, Rosa said with the gentleness of someone delivering a fact that needs to be felt before it can be understood. I sat with the particular weight of that. The tears in the alley suddenly felt less private than they had, and also, somehow, more private, because he'd seen them knowing what he knew, and he'd still just asked if I was safe and then gone. Rosa set a plate in front of me. Scrambled eggs, which I hadn't asked for but apparently needed. He doesn't do things without reason, she said, but sometimes his reasons take a while to become clear. I asked about Greco that afternoon. She told me what she'd tell me. Enough to understand the size of the problem, not enough to give me nightmares. Greco had been Marco's ally for a decade. Something had fractured it. Whatever had fractured it was the reason Greco now moved against Marco through me. He knows Marco would care about. She stopped. About what? I said. She picked up her cloth and turned back to the counter. Ask Marco, she said. I didn't. He came to find me instead, that evening, in the narrow garden behind the house where I'd taken to standing for 20 minutes after dinner, because the sky was visible there, and I missed having access to sky. He appeared in the doorway and I heard him before I saw him, which was unusual because he moved without sound when he chose to. He stood beside me for a moment, not speaking, looking at the same rectangle of night. "You should know what you're actually in," he said. "I'm learning," I said. "No, what I'm going to tell you now." He told me about Greco's network, the reach of it, the specific threat to me, not theoretical, but actual. With the timeline Enzo had confirmed that morning, Greco intended to use me as a message. He'd done it before, to others who mattered to people Marco cared about. The intention was to demonstrate that Marco's protections had limits. "You're saying he'll hurt me," I said. "He'll try," Marco said. "The distinction, is that meant to be reassuring?" I said. Something moved through him, just beneath the surface. Not amusement, exactly, but adjacent to it. "No," he said. I looked at him sideways. He was looking at the sky. His profile in the dark was the profile of a man who had spent a very long time making himself impossible to read and had not lost a single round. "My father never told me any of this," I said. "No. Did he know you'd know? That if something happened to him, I don't know what he expected." I accepted that. It was the most human answer he'd given me. From inside the house came a sound. Enzo's voice, low and sharp at the edges in a way I hadn't heard yet. Marco was moving before I fully registered it, through the door with the speed of someone who had long since stopped distinguishing between deciding and doing. I stood in the garden alone. The cold settled around me. Someone was moving against them, he'd said. The us in the sentence had been implicit, unannounced, and I felt it settle somewhere in my chest like something dropped from a height. I hadn't asked to be part of his us. I noticed, standing in the dark, that I hadn't protested it either. The threat had a name by the fourth day. A man called Rinaldi, one of Greco's lieutenants, photographed 3 times in the past week within 4 blocks of the house. Marco showed me the photographs without explanation, which I took to mean he'd decided I was allowed to understand the specific shape of the danger rather than simply its existence. I looked at the photographs. Middle-aged man, unremarkable face, the kind of forgettable that I now understood was not accidental. "What does he want?" I asked. "Information," Marco said. "About you. Your schedule, whether you're here. And is that dangerous?" He looked at me in a way that answered the question without requiring an answer. That afternoon, Marco had meetings I wasn't privy to. Men came. The sound of Italian filtered through the house. Controlled, clipped, the way language sounds when it's being used for precision rather than conversation. I stayed in the kitchen with Rosa, who taught me how she made her tomato sauce, which involved an argument with the tomatoes that she narrated in a way that made me laugh for the first time in what felt like a long time. Marco appeared in the kitchen doorway when the laugh was still in the air. He stopped. Just for a moment. Something passed through his expression and was immediately managed. He said something to Rosa in Italian. She responded without looking up from the pan. He turned to go. "You can come in," I said. He paused. "I live here," he said. "You look like you were deciding whether to," I said. One of those silences, the kind he used instead of disagreement. Then he came in and stood at the counter and accepted the coffee Rosa handed him with the automatic precision of a ritual. His hands. He held the cup in both hands, which was the first unguarded thing I'd seen him do. He looked at the steam rather than at anything in particular. Somewhere else, briefly. Not absent, more like reviewing something internal that required looking at the middle distance. "Were you born here?" I asked. "In Chicago?" He looked at me. "Born in Naples," he said. "Came here at 6. Do you remember it?" "Pieces," he said. "The smell. The light." It was more than I'd expected, and I was careful not to show how much I wanted more of it. Later that evening, I was coming down the hall from the bathroom and he was coming up from the basement. I nearly walked into him, which I would not have anticipated being a possibility, because he moved as if space announced itself to him in advance, but I wasn't paying attention. I was thinking about Rosa's sauce and whether I'd remembered to call my landlord about the notice, and he rounded the corner at the same moment I did and stopped. I stopped. We were close. Closer than we'd been, the hallway being what it was. He smelled like cold air and something underneath that I decided immediately not to try to name. There was a cut on the back of his right hand, fresh, a thin dark line. I looked at it without meaning to. "You're hurt," I said. "It's nothing." I looked up. He was watching my face. "Let me see," I said. "Aria." The way he said my name. Just that, nothing after it, with a quality in the sound that stopped me where I stood. Not a command, not a warning. Something without a clean category. "I'm not going to die from a cut," he said. "I know," I said. I didn't know how to finish the sentence honestly. His expression shifted. Something moved in it. Careful, weighted. A man recognizing something he hasn't allowed himself to recognize yet and choosing to file it away rather than hold it in the light. "Good night," he said. He moved past me. His arm brushed mine as he passed. Briefest contact, the kind that happens in narrow hallways and means nothing. Except it didn't mean nothing. It meant something to my nervous system that I spent the next 2 hours failing to talk myself out of. He found the cut still bothering him at midnight. He stood in the kitchen in the dark and ran cold water over it and thought about the specific shape of her face when she'd seen it. Not fear, not pity, just immediate, unthinking concern. He had spent 19 years surrounded by people whose emotions were directed at him for effect, who felt things in his presence and shaped those feelings into useful tools. She hadn't shaped anything. She'd just looked at his hand and said, "Let me see," in the tone of someone who intended to do a practical thing. He was going to have to be more careful. He knew what Greco would do if he understood what this had become. He also knew, with a different and less reliable kind of clarity, that he'd been filing away the sound of her laughter for 3 days without choosing to. He turned off the water. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, which was not unusual, but the reason was new. I told myself the hallway meant nothing. I was convincing at this because I'd had practice. I had 17 months of convincing myself that my father's death was manageable, that his debts were manageable, that working dinner shifts on feet that hurt by 9 was something a person simply did and then stopped doing when the circumstances changed. I was good at telling myself things that weren't quite true until they became at least livable. On the 6th morning, the thing I'd been keeping in a separate compartment arrived without my permission. Rosa knocked before breakfast and told me Enzo needed to speak with me. He met me in the sitting room holding a thin file folder, the kind of official thinness that contains more weight than its size suggests. He told me it had been found in my father's effects through a contact managing the original creditor's documents. Then he left the room, which I understood was the closest thing to privacy he could offer. Inside the folder were 3 pages. The first was a ledger entry. Dates and amounts, my father's name as guarantor. The second was a letter from the original lender, formal, dated 8 years ago. The third was a photograph. In the photograph, my father was standing in front of Sorrento's. He was standing with another man, arm around his shoulders, both of them laughing. The other man's face I didn't recognize. I would learn his name shortly. Marco appeared in the doorway. "You knew," I said. "Not until last week." "But you knew before you came to the alley." "Yes," he said. I looked at the photograph, then at him. "What else do you know about my father that I don't?" I said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from me. The first time I'd seen him sit in my proximity, rather than stand, it changed the geometry. Brought him level with me rather than above, which I thought was probably deliberate. He was trying to get out, Marco said. The debt was the last piece. He'd been paying it quietly for years. He was nearly done when he died. I looked at the ledger entries, the amounts, the dates, years of payments I'd had no idea existed. "He never told me," I said. "No, why not?" "Probably," Marco said carefully, "because he didn't want you to carry it." I sat with the particular weight of that. My father, who had seemed so sad in his last years, who had worked long hours at a job that paid little, who had been quietly solving a problem he'd kept from me completely, who died before the solution finished. And then I picked it up, I said, "The payments." Marco was quiet. "You knew about that too," I said. "Yes, How long? Long enough. I looked at him. He was watching me with an expression that was, for the first time, openly careful. Not guarded. Careful. The distinction was important. Guarded is about protection. Careful is about not wanting to get something wrong. So when you stopped in the alley, I said, when you asked if I was safe. I couldn't finish the sentence. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because what I wanted to say was too large for the room. I'd been looking for the right way to approach you for 2 weeks, he said. I hadn't found it. And then you drove past and saw, yes, he said. Something tightened in my chest. Not anger. Not gratitude. Something without a clean name. I wasn't performing, I said. In the alley, I want you to know that. I thought I was alone. I know, he said. He said it with a certainty that was not dismissive, and that certainty undid something in me I'd been keeping very carefully knotted. I've been handling it alone for 14 months, I said. My voice was steady but only just. I know, he said again. I stopped. That's actually worse. That you know. His expression shifted. Something moved through it that he let move through without stopping it. Something quiet and genuine and briefly visible before settling back into his usual containment. You don't have to handle it alone anymore, he said. It was the simplest sentence he'd said to me. Also the most frightening. I don't know how to do that, I said. You don't have to know how, he said. You just have to stop. I looked at him across the space between our chairs. He was looking at me with that fullness of attention, the specific, unhurried kind with no agenda in it that I could detect. He hadn't moved toward me. He didn't. That evening, word came through Enzo of movement on Greco's side. A vehicle spotted twice outside a property Marco owned across the city. A call intercepted. The thing that had been theoretical for 5 days was becoming specific. Marco's face, as Enzo reported this, went still in a different way than usual. The careful man receded. Something older came forward. I watched him become what he was in his world and felt the ground shift under my own 2 feet. The attempt came on a Thursday. I was not where they expected me to be. This was either careful planning on Marco's part or coincidence, and I would come to understand it was the former. The schedule they'd fed through a controlled source had placed me across the city on an evening when I was actually in the kitchen, helping Rosa pit olives for something she refused to fully explain. The men came through the side entrance. The noise was discreet. Not a crash, not an explosion. Muffled sounds, quick and purposeful. And then the kitchen door opened, and Marco was there. He looked at Rosa first, then at me. Basement, he said. Both of you, now. Rosa moved without question. She had done this before. I could tell by the absence of hesitation. I followed her down the stairs into a room I hadn't known existed. Solid walls. A locked door that Rosa locked from the inside with a key she'd apparently kept in her apron pocket at all times, which told me something about how long she'd worked here and what she'd learned to anticipate. We sat on the concrete floor in the dark and didn't speak. I could hear my own heartbeat. Above us, sounds moved through the house. Not random, organized. Someone directing, responding, containing. I knew by the efficiency of them that what was happening was not chaos. It was Marco managing something he prepared for, which is different from chaos in the way a controlled burn is different from a wildfire. When the door opened 20 minutes later, it was Enzo. Clear, he said. Upstairs, the house showed evidence of the night, in the way Marco's world showed its evidence. Subtle, cleaned rapidly. Men I didn't recognize moving with purposeful quiet through the entrance hall. I didn't look too closely. I understood already that some things in this world you received without looking at directly. Marco was in the front room. Standing with his back to the door, he didn't turn when I came in, his hands at his sides. The cut on his right hand from 3 days ago still showed its healing line. His shirt was intact, which I catalogued with a relief I recognized as disproportionate and couldn't help. Are you hurt? I asked. He turned then. He looked different. Not changed, more visible. The control was still present, but thinner, like a film of ice over something moving underneath. His eyes moved over me in a single quick pass, taking inventory. No, he said. Are you? No, I said. We stood across the room from each other. The distance felt very large and very small at once. This was Greco, he said. I know. It won't be the last I know, I said again. He stopped. He looked at me. You're not, he started. I'm frightened, I said. I'm not going to pretend I'm not, but I'm not falling apart. Something in his expression shifted, and it was the same shift I'd seen in the hallway, in the kitchen doorway, in the garden. The movement of a man recognizing something he had decided not to recognize and failing. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. He crossed the room. Stopped close enough that I could have reached him, which I was aware of without acting on it. His eyes were completely direct. No space between looking at me and being somewhere else. The reason I stopped in the alley, he said, was not because I knew who you were. I waited. I'd known who you were for 2 weeks, he said. I'd driven past that restaurant 4 times. I always passed, because I had a plan, and the plan didn't involve acting until the situation was managed. And then I saw you. He stopped. And I stopped. Why? I said. Because, he said. And for the first time, he sounded like a man having difficulty with language. You said you were fine. I looked at him. You were alone in an alley in the dark. You'd been crying. And when my window came down, you said, I'm fine. And then you asked me to leave. He paused. Everyone in my world gives me their vulnerability like it's an offer. You just put yours away. Didn't offer it. Didn't want anything from me. You just closed it off and stood there and told me you were fine. The room was very quiet. That's why you stopped, I said. That's why I've been. He stopped again. Drew a breath. Let it out slowly. Yes. I looked at him for a long moment. I was aware of everything, the cold still living in my hands from the basement floor. The sound from outside of whatever was being managed. The particular quality of his stillness this close, which had heat in it. I'm not fine, I said. I should say that. I said it in the alley because that's what I say. It's what I always say. I know, he said. But I'm here, I said. I'm not leaving. He looked at me, and what I saw in his face was the uncovered version. Not the controlled man, not the thing his world had made him, but something underneath. The cost of things, the weight of decisions made without mercy, the specific loneliness of being the person who makes them. I reached out and put my hand over the healed cut on his. He went very still. Okay, he said, quietly. Just that. I didn't move my hand. He turned his over, slowly, so my palm rested against his. He didn't close his fingers. He just let it be. The most careful thing I'd seen him do. Outside, his men were cleaning up the edges of the first battle of a war that had already arrived. The war came the way real things come. Not all at once, but in sequence. Each event following from the last with a cold logic that left no room for disbelief. In the week after the breach, Marco's operations tightened. The number of men in the house doubled. The routes I could take became fixed. Enzo walked with me when I walked at all, which was increasingly rarely. And he did so with the vigilant ease of someone who had been guarding valuable things for decades and had learned to make it look like company. I got used to Enzo. He told me in pieces about his time with the Valentino family, 23 years. He'd come to Vittorio before Marco, and Marco had inherited him the way a house inherits its structural walls, foundationally, irreplaceably. He talked about Marco the way you talk about someone whose qualities you've cataloged so thoroughly you've stopped needing to compliment them. He was 17 when Lucia died, Enzo said one morning without prompting. We were in the garden, which Marco had decided was acceptable as long as Enzo was present and the route to the door was clear. His sister? I said. Yes. Enzo was quiet. Message to his father. Different enemy, different time. But the lesson Marco took was, he stopped. He decided that every person who mattered to him was a target, so he stopped letting people matter. I looked at the back wall. Until what? I said. Enzo looked at me steadily. I'm telling you now, he said. 2 days later, Greco moved. Not against the house, against something smaller and more precise. A message. Greco's people found the younger brother of one of Marco's lieutenants, a 22-year-old named Tomas, outside a bar in Pilsen at 11 on a Wednesday. Tomas survived, but he would spend 2 weeks in the hospital and leave it with 3 things he hadn't entered with. Marco received the news standing. His face did not change. Nothing moved in his expression. Nothing gave way. He listened to Enzo speak, then said one sentence in Italian that I didn't understand, but that Enzo received like it had weight. Then Marco looked at me. "Stay in the house," he said. "I am," I said. "No. I mean..." He stopped. Something passed through his face. "The next 72 hours, don't go near the front windows." "Okay," I said. He looked at me a moment longer than the instruction required. Then he left. I found Rosa and told her about Tomas. She made a sound, low, specific, the sound grief makes when it's housed in someone who has made a long practice of not letting it stay. She knew Tomas, had fed him on Sundays when he came with his brother to the house. "He's 22, she said. "Yes," I said. "He has a girlfriend, was going to ask her to marry him in the spring." We sat at the kitchen table and neither of us spoke for a while. Outside, the city went on with its ordinary noise, traffic, a door, a child's voice 2 buildings over, and in here it was very quiet. "This is what it cost," Rosa said finally, "being close to this world. You should know that." I looked at her. "Are you telling me to leave?" I said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I'm telling you to know what you're choosing, if you choose it." I went to my room that night and sat on the bed in the dark and had the conversation with myself I'd been deferring. Rosa was right. I could see it clearly. I could leave. I had, somewhere in the city, a life that was battered and financially precarious, but it was outside this. Tomas was 22 and in a hospital, and Marco was somewhere in the city right now, doing what he did when someone touched something he protected. I sat with all of it. Then I sat with the specific memory of his face in the front room. That uncovered version. The weight of things. The careful way he turned his hand over. What he'd told me about the alley, the way he'd said it, searching for language, finding it slowly, like a man unused to needing words for his own interior. And what Enzo had told me, he decided that every person who mattered was a target. So he stopped letting people matter. I thought about my father, who had kept a secret to protect me, who had handled it alone. I got up in the dark. I went to Rosa's door and knocked softly. When she opened it, I said, "I'm staying." She looked at me for a long moment. "You know why?" she said. "Yes," I said. "I know why." She nodded. "Once." She put her hand briefly against my face, dry and warm, the gesture of someone who doesn't often make gestures, and went back to bed. I went back to my room. Marco returned at 4 in the morning. I heard the door, the murmur of him and Enzo in the hall, the house settling around him. I lay in the dark and breathed. In the morning, he was gone again. 2 of his men were not. They took me on a Friday afternoon. Marco's people were good, but Greco's people were patient, which is a different kind of good. They had studied the fixed route. They had watched for where the schedules hardened. One of Greco's men had been inside the information flow from the beginning. I learned this later, in pieces. But the piece I received first was the physical fact of a vehicle appearing alongside mine on a route I'd been told was clear. Enzo was driving, the car beside us cutting close enough to use his door as a lever. The next minutes had the quality of things that happened faster than comprehension. Sounds. Enzo's voice cutting through in Italian, my door coming open from the outside. I had time to understand what was happening and not quite enough time to move before the hand closed on my arm and I was not in the car anymore. They were not cruel immediately. I note this, not because it was reassuring, but because it was informative. Greco wanted me functional. I was a message, not a casualty. There is a specific awfulness to being handled carefully when the handling is not kindness. They took me to a building. Industrial neighborhood, rail corridor. The sound of water somewhere nearby. A room with a chair bolted to the floor, which told me the room had been used for this purpose before. A man sat across from me. Not Greco. a representative which told me Greco considered himself above the logistics of intimidation. "You're going to send a message," the man said. "To Marco," I said. "Yes. What's the message?" He looked at me with a kind of surprised blankness. I wasn't performing the expected scene. I wasn't hysterical. I wasn't bargaining. I was asking a practical question about the parameters of my situation. "Mr. Greco wants Valentino to withdraw from the Northwest Territory Agreement," the man said. "That seems like something to discuss directly," I said. "Mr. Greco prefers leverage." "Right," I said. I looked at the room. The door was solid. 2 men outside by the sound of it. The chair was bolted, but I was not. They hadn't restrained me, which was either confident or careless. I chose to believe it was the latter. There is a specific quality to silence when you are alone in a dangerous room and you have to decide whether you are the kind of person who waits or the kind who does something. I had always thought of myself as a waiter. I had always been good at patience, at endurance, at handling things quietly and alone. Sitting in that chair, I discovered that handling things quietly was not the same as being passive. I started talking. Not to the representative who had gone to stand by the wall. I talked to the room. I talked about the Northwest Territory Agreement with the specificity of a person who had been living in a house where such things were discussed and had spent 3 weeks paying very close attention. I knew the names. I knew enough to sound like I knew considerably more than I did. The representative's expression changed. "Where did you?" "He talks to me," I said. "Marco. He talks to me." This was, at best, partly true, but what I'd given them was something worth reporting, which meant they needed to make a phone call, which meant they were focused on something other than me for exactly long enough. The phone call happened. The representative stepped into the hall. I didn't run. Running was not a realistic option. What I did was move the chair. It took longer than I expected. The bolts were in the floor, not the chair. I'd been wrong about that. The chair was heavy but movable. I moved it against the wall beside the door as quietly as I could manage and sat back down and waited with the specific patience I'd been cultivating for 26 years. When the representative returned, he opened the door without looking at the room first. That was the error. And I had stepped aside with a simplicity that surprised him more than he could compensate for. In the moment his attention adjusted, Enzo came through the door behind him. It was over very quickly after that. Enzo had found me in 40 minutes. In the car, he looked at me in the rearview mirror. "You moved the chair," he said. "Yes," I said. A pause. "Good," he said. The traitor in Marco's information chain was identified before midnight. His name was Borelli. Young, in the outer ring of the family, turned by money and fear and the particular vulnerability of someone who believed the wrong side was going to win. Marco received this information from Enzo and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "Where is she?" "Coming back now," Enzo said. "Safe." The specific quality of the silence that followed that word was something Enzo would not fully describe to me until months later. Marco was at the door when the car arrived. He was standing on the front steps in his shirt sleeves, which was the most visually incorrect thing I'd ever seen. November, no concession to it. Standing there in the way of a man who had been standing somewhere for a long time and was still working on coming down from whatever had sustained him through it. I got out of the car. He came down the steps. He stopped in front of me. His eyes went over me. That inventory, rapid, taking account of everything. His hands came up and didn't quite touch me, suspended just at the edges of my arms. "Are you?" "I'm fine," I said. He looked at me. Something in his face cracked. Just slightly. A hairline fracture in the control, a single fault line. "No," he said. "Don't." I looked at him. "Tell me the truth," he said. For once, I thought about the alley, about all the times I'd said it since, about the specific way it had become armor so long worn I'd stopped noticing its weight. "I'm frightened," I said. "I'm physically okay, but I'm frightened, and I stopped. I'm glad to be here." He absorbs that. He put his arms around me. Not dramatically, not with any urgency that would make it theater. He just put his arms around me carefully, and I felt his hands against my back and the specific temperature of him, which was warmer than expected given the cold, and the quality of his stillness close up, which was not empty stillness but held stillness, the kind that has something in it that it's trying not to break. I put my face against his shoulder. I didn't cry. I was past crying and into the territory beyond it where everything is just present tense relief. We stood like that for a moment. Then, "Come inside." Marco and Enzo spoke in the room off the hall, Italian, 30 minutes, while Rosa fed me soup I didn't want, but ate because Rosa's face, when I rejected food, was a specific kind of small suffering I'd learned to avoid. When Marco came back, his face had settled into its usual arrangement, but the hairline fracture was still there if he knew where to look. I knew where to look. "Greco," he said, "it's time." "I know," I said. "It's going to get worse before I know," I said again. He looked at me for a moment. His hands were flat on the table between us. "You don't have to be here for it," he said. "I could send you somewhere. Safe, actually safe, with people I trust." "No," I said, Aria. "No," I said again. "I understand what you're offering. I understand why. But I'm not going to stand behind you. Not anymore. I've been standing behind things my whole life. I'm done with it." He was very quiet. "I'm not asking you to fight," he said. "I know what you're asking," I said. "The answer is still no." He looked at his hands, then at me. Something in his expression was doing several things at once. "The reason I stopped in the alley," he said, "was because you wanted to be left alone with your pain." I understood that. "I've been doing it my whole life." "I know," I said, "and I'm asking you now to let me." He stopped, looked away, looked back. "To let this end be mine, so you don't have to carry it." I was quiet for a long time. "Lucia," I said. He went very still. "Rosa told me," I said, "not the details, just enough." He said nothing. "You built all of this," I said, "so you'd never lose someone that way again, so you'd have enough control that the people who—" I stopped. "That the people who matter would be safe." "Yes," he said, quietly. "You think sending me away is protecting me." "It is." "Marco," I said, "I'm not Lucia." The silence was long enough to breathe. "I know," he said. "I'm not someone who needs to be protected from knowing what's happening. Being next to you, knowing what's happening, that's what keeping me safe actually looks like. For me." He sat with that. I watched the very precise internal work of a man revising a decision that had held for 19 years. "All right," he said finally. "Not happy. Not comfortable." "All right." Salvatore Greco's face appeared in a surveillance photograph Enzo brought that night, grainy, taken outside a building in the south of the city. He looked in the photograph like any middle-aged man with power he'd stopped questioning. He looked nothing like Marco's mirror. But I understood, by now, why the comparison held. They had made the same choices at the same crossroads. One had kept something human in the aftermath. One had not. I thought, Marco is not that. I thought, he has to know he's not that. The final confrontation was nothing like the movies. There was no open ground, no clear sky, no theatrical facing off. It was a warehouse in the South Corridor at 3 a.m. It smelled like diesel and standing water, and it was full of organized men on both sides who had been building toward this moment for weeks and were now executing it with the cold efficiency of professionals. Marco had made arrangements I was part of. I want to be clear about what that meant. I was not a fighter, not a variable in his tactical plan. I was a person who refused to be behind a door not knowing what was happening. So I was there, with Enzo's hand at my back, in the area Marco had designated, elevated and covered with 2 exits he'd explained to me twice. I watched. I had not known, before this, what it looked like when Marco Valentino was completely unleashed. I had seen the controlled version, the stillness, the economy of movement, the voice that didn't require volume. I had seen the cracks, the hallway, the front room after the breach, his face on the steps when I'd come back. But this was the full architecture of what he was. He moved through that warehouse like a man who had already mapped every possible outcome and was simply executing the one he'd chosen. He was not brutal the way I'd feared, not savage, not unthinking. He was precise. More precise than the men around him who moved with their own competence. He was operating at a level beyond competence. That was something else. Full deployment of everything he built and trained and suppressed for 19 years into a single coherent intention. It was terrifying. It was also, I cannot fully explain this, beautiful in the way extreme competence is always beautiful, even when what it's competent at is violence. I stayed where I was. I'd promised Marco 2 things. I would not move from the designated area, and I would not do anything that required him to redirect attention to me. I kept both. I held Enzo's arm and watched and breathed. Greco's men fell back in stages. This took time. There was noise, controlled noise, not chaos. And then there was less noise, and then a specific silence that moved through the warehouse like a temperature change. Greco himself appeared near the center, brought there by his own men's retreat rather than by design. He looked, in person, smaller than the photograph. That's often true of things you've spent a long time being afraid of. He looked at Marco across the space between them, and his face moved through several things. "You could end this," Greco said. "I am," Marco said. It was not a long conversation. What Greco offered. Territory, money, the original debt dissolved, the elaborate set of compromises that would have required Marco to forgive a decade of deliberate damage. Marco listened to without expression and declined in the same tone he used for everything. "There's a line," Marco said, "that you crossed when you touched her. Not possessive. Not territorial. Just factual." The most factual thing he said all night. Greco was contained by Marco's men without additional violence, which was its own kind of statement. He was not given the death that would have made him simple. He was given what Enzo would explain later. The very particular version of powerlessness he'd been dealing out for years. Alive. Finished. Aware of both. Victory, I understood in that warehouse, is not clean. Marco came to me when it was over. Not immediately, because there were things requiring his attention first, and I was not more important than those things, which was something I'd come to understand and not need explanation about. He came when he could. He stood in front of me. Unhurt. Which my eyes confirmed before any other part of me could process language. "It's over," he said. I looked at him. He looked different than he had at the start of the night. Not damaged, not diminished. Changed. The way a thing is changed after it's been tested to its limit and held. "Are you okay?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't think so, not right now." It was the most honest answer he'd given me since the day he'd told me why he'd stopped in the alley. "That's okay," I said. He looked at me, grateful, which was not something I'd catalogued in his expression before. "Come on," I said. "Let's go home." He nodded. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent to the geometry of events that had just resolved inside that warehouse, running its ordinary operations. Lights and noise and the cold air with November in it. We walked to the car. I put my hand in his. He held it. That was all. That was enough. The world rebuilt itself quietly. Not a metaphor. It was literal and gradual. The men in the house thinned back to the usual rotation. The phone calls Enzo fielded at all hours became the usual calls at usual hours. Rosa made food that required full attention to appreciate, rather than food that could be eaten quickly without tasting, which was how I measured the return of normal. I was still there. This needed to be decided at some point, and we didn't decide it for 3 weeks. We simply continued. I went with Enzo sometimes when he had business that wasn't dangerous, which let me back into the city, into the grocery store and the dry cleaner, and once, briefly, to Sorrento's. My manager expressed the particular regret of someone who has realized belatedly that a variable he'd undervalued was more important than he'd calculated. I told him I wouldn't be coming back. Walking out of Sorrento's for the last time, I stopped in the alley. It looked smaller in daylight, less consequential. Just brick and fryer vents and a wedge of November sky. I stood where I'd stood 2 months ago and looked at the place at the alley's mouth where a car had stopped, and I tried to feel something significant. What I felt was tired and grateful, and underneath both, something quieter that I was still learning to name. I went back to the house. Marco was at his desk in the front room when I arrived. Papers, phone, the ordinary instruments of running something large and complicated. He looked up when I came in but didn't say anything immediately. "I went to the restaurant," I said. "I know," he said. Which meant Enzo had told him. Which was fine. "I told them I wasn't coming back," I said. "Okay," he said. I stopped. "I need to know what I'm staying for. What this is. What you—" I stopped again, because the sentence had several endings and I wasn't sure which was the right one. He put down what he was holding. He looked at me across the room with that particular fullness of attention, the same as the alley, the same as every moment I'd catalogued, and stood. He crossed the room, stopped in front of me, close. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to take it seriously." "All right," I said. "Stay," he said. "Not because you have nowhere else. Not because the situation requires it. Because you choose to. Because you." He stopped. The particular stop of a man for whom language is not usually difficult, finding it so, "Because you want to be here." I looked at him. "I want to be here," I said. "I know," he said, "but I'm asking you to say it, so that it's said." I understood. He needed the thing named. He had spent 19 years not naming things so they couldn't be taken from him. He was naming this. "I want to be here," I said again. "With you. Whatever that means for what your life is, I've seen it. I don't have illusions about it. I know what I'm choosing, and I choose it." He was quiet for a moment. "Marry me," he said. He said it without theater, directly, in the same tone as everything else, with the same economy he used for everything that mattered to him. No ring, no gesture, nothing arranged. Just him and me in the front room with the afternoon light coming through the window and the ordinary sounds of the house around us. I looked at him. "Yes," I said. He exhaled. Just breath, released, the most uncontrolled thing I'd heard from him. "Yes," I said again, because it deserved to be said twice. He put his hands on my face, very gently, the same care he'd shown in the front room after the breach, turning his hand over so my palm rested in his. "This world," he said, "it doesn't become safe. You know that." "I know," I said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "I know," I said. "Marco, I know." He looked at me. "You've never once asked me to change it," he said. "No," I said. "I wouldn't know who you'd be if you did." Something moved through his expression, large and quiet, the way weather moves through a landscape. He was, I thought, being seen by a person who was not afraid of what they saw. Rosa appeared in the doorway, took in the room, and disappeared without a word. I heard her footsteps down the hall and then the specific sound of her making coffee, which was her way of marking things that mattered. Marco's people came to understand the change incrementally. A few received it with wariness. Ferretti, who had been with the family since before Enzo, told me once in the kitchen that Marco was different than he'd been in years, and that the difference was apparent to anyone who had known him long enough to register what was missing before. I thought about that for a while. About what it meant to be someone's first unpracticed thing. Their first honest want in a long time. That evening, Marco read his papers and I read a book Rosa had lent me, and the house was quiet around us. Ordinary. The most radical thing that had happened since the alley. 6 months later, I burned the soup on a Thursday afternoon. It was, if I'm honest, a spectacular failure. I'd been trying to replicate Rosa's tomato sauce from memory, which was ambitious given that Rosa's memory and mine had not been in the room together when she made it, and I had apparently not paid sufficient attention to the garlic stage, which had a considerably narrower margin than I'd understood, the kitchen filled with smoke. I opened the window. Rosa appeared, assessed the situation, made a sound that suggested this was nothing she hadn't managed before, and took over without commentary. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the smoke clear into the November air. Another November, A full year since the first one. The alley, the headlights against the brick, and felt the specific ordinariness of the afternoon settle around me. Marco appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the pan. He looked at Rosa. He looked at me. "I'm fine," I said. It came out automatic, the way it always did. The way it had in the alley, the way it had in front of him a dozen times. The reflex of a woman who had learned early to close her own grief off from the air. He was still for a moment. Then something happened in his face. The same thing that had happened 19 months ago at the mouth of an alley, when a car stopped and a window came down, and I'd said those two words to the dark. The same shift, the same landing. He crossed the kitchen, came to stand beside me at the window. "Are you?" he said. I looked at him. "No," I said. "The soup is gone and Rosa is disappointed in me and I was going to do something nice, and instead I made smoke." "She's not disappointed," he said. "She's being polite." "Rosa doesn't do polite," he said. "She's pleased you tried." I looked at Rosa, who was managing the pan with the focused attention of someone who finds satisfaction in solving problems, regardless of their origin. He was right. "I burned it," I said. "Yes," he said. "I just said I was fine," I said, by reflex. "I still do that." "I know," he said. He was looking at me with that full attention. The unhurried, completely present kind, the kind that had unsettled me when it first arrived, that I'd understood and named only gradually, that I'd come to count on the way you count on structure. "I know you do." "Does it still?" I stopped. He waited. "Does it still land the same way?" I said. "When I do it?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November air moved through the open window and brought the smell of the city. Cold concrete. Someone's exhaust. The faint sweetness of the bakery 3 streets over. "Yes," he said. I looked at him. "In the alley," he said. "It landed like something I couldn't name. Because no one had ever done it in front of me. Just closed themselves off like that. Wanted to be left alone with their own pain. Didn't offer it, didn't use it. Just had it privately, in the dark." I was very still. "And now?" I said. "Now," he said. "When you do it, it still lands the same way. But I know what it means. I know what's underneath it. I know you're going to tell me eventually, or you're going to work through it yourself. And I know which one you'll choose and when." "And?" I said. "And I've stopped needing you to do it differently," he said. I looked at him. "You've stopped trying to fix it," I said. "I've stopped trying to fix it," he said. This was, I understood, one of the most significant things he'd ever told me. He who fixed things. He who had built an empire on the logic that everything controllable should be controllable. He had learned, somewhere in the last year, that this specific thing, my particular way of hoarding my own pain, was not a problem requiring solution. It was just me, the specific, non-negotiable texture of me. And it still landed in him the same way it had in the alley. Rosa said something in Italian without looking up from the pan. Marco responded. She made a dismissive gesture. He almost smiled. "She says there's enough for dinner if we're not all too ashamed to eat it," he said. "I'm not ashamed," I said. "I'm a bad cook. It's different." He looked at me. The almost smile finished arriving. "Yes," he said. "It is." The house around us was what it had become, settled, inhabited, specific. The men who came and went had faces I knew. Enzo had dinner with us on Wednesdays, which had begun as practical and become something else. Rosa had stopped looking at me the way she'd looked at me that first morning, measuring for survival, and started looking at me the way she looked at things she considered permanent. Marco's world was what it was, not safe in the way some worlds are safe. There were things in it I looked at directly and things I'd learned to receive without looking directly. I had not become a different person inside it. I had, if anything, become more fully myself, which was something I hadn't expected and couldn't entirely explain. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from my face, very lightly. The gesture of someone who has permission and knows it. "Dinner in an hour," Rosa said without turning around. "We'll be there," Marco said. We stood at the window a moment longer in the November air. The city ran its ordinary operations below and around us, indifferent and continuous. I was fine. For the first time in a very long time, when I said it, I meant it. And he, standing beside me, could feel the difference.